Okay, so I'm talking about the response of coastal mollusk faunas to the PETM in northwest Europe. Now, most of us have heard, probably all of us I hope, have heard of the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, a short period hypothermal, 56 million years ago, when there was a vast release of CO2 into the atmosphere from probably multiple sources, including submarine methane hydrates, thermogenic methane, and perhaps from melting Antarctic permafrost and peat. And this rapid injection of CO2 led to a worldwide increase in temperature, sea surface temperatures, say, between 5 and 8 degrees. And this is being used as an analogue or at least a comparative system, if you like, to anthropogenic change at the current day, even though, you know, what we're doing now to the Earth system is probably 2 orders of magnitude more rapid. So this just shows a map of global effects from South et al., including photic zone euxinia, the basically drop in seafloor oxygen content, increase in sediment supply due to increased precipitation, and the increase in temperature. So it really was a global event. And the biotic effects of this are actually pretty well known. So there was extinction, radiation, and dispersal of mammals, range extensions of mid-latitude faunas, deep-sea benthic forams, extinction of about 50%. The key organism here is a pectodinium, which is a warm water dinoflagellate cyst, and this is like an indicator organism, as it really abounds in all sorts of aquatic sediments around the interval, so it's a very good indicator for the PETM interval. And a whole bunch of open ocean effects of plankton were affected. But strangely, what we really don't know much about is what happened to coastal biotic faunas. Now, there's 4 areas of the world where there is a fairly good or complete, more or less complete, sedimentary sequence of shallow water faunas, including the Gulf Coast and Atlantic coast of the US, Egypt, and northwest Europe. And I shall talk about the last here. So, Spire et al. Said, the response of most marine invertebrates during the PETM is virtually unknown. And there's some good reasons for that. Often sediments become anoxic over that interval, or there's decalcification, so the calcareous faunas just aren't there. So at the moment, there seems to be a real absence of data. However, there's 2 areas where there is some data, but it's paradoxical. So there seems to be contrasting regional patterns in these 2 regions. Gulf coastal plain of the USA, there doesn't seem to be a faunal turnover of shallow coastal faunas in the PETM. And the PETM is actually within one lithostratigraphical group. So historically, it was never really identified as an event, in contrast to Europe, where the Thanetian-Epresian boundary is at the PETM. And that was established by paleobotany, a paleobotanist, but then rapidly extended to marine fauna. So clearly something happened at that time. The caveat is, with the US data sets, actually there's very coarse temporal resolution. So maybe our data's just not fine enough to pick up the event. So I'm going to focus today on the possible resolution of this paradox based on the new higher resolution data set from Northwest Europe. So the North Sea basin is probably globally the best studied marine Paleogene basin, and that's because of the vast amount of data created through hydrocarbon research and exploitation. And really, when we're thinking about coastal faunas here in the North Sea, the southwest margin, I think you can just see the UK here and northern France, it's a little bit faint. Essentially, the faunas of this rather enclosed basin are essentially controlled by tectonics, climate change, and new static sea level, which are affecting these, whether these seaways connecting the North Sea basin with the Arctic Ocean and the Atlantic were actually open or shut. Why mollusks? These are all the things that everyone says are great about mollusks, so I won't rehearse them. I guess a really useful thing with mollusks is that there's great conservatism of ecological traits with taxonomy. So usually at the family or superfamily level, one can make predictions, so you can use taxonomic uniformitarianism of recent organisms to interpret dead ones. And here I've got a traits database, but I'm just going to focus on salinity tolerance. Now the challenges of mollusks are their absolute vast diversity, and perhaps more importantly, a lot of variance in assemblage composition. And that means you've got to look at a large number of samples, and actually rather large-sized samples, to really get consistent patterns out when you're looking at the fossil record. Okay, here's the sample sites. The London, Hampshire and Paris basins, I say basin, but actually they're parts of a single depositional basin which was dissected by a Cenozoic uplift. And this is basically marginal marine sediments in the southwest margin of the North Sea basin. Stratigraphic coverage, for those of you who know your stratigraphy here. And really it's looking at about 2 to 3 million years of sediments either side of the PETM, and PETM here at 56 to 55.8 million years old, million years ago. So we're trying to sort of get a baseline, see what happens at the PETM and then what happens afterwards. And our criteria at the right here are to try to establish maximum compatibility of the faunas, standard things. 34 sampled horizons. Due to the great integrated biostratigraphy, magnetostratigraphy, sequence stratigraphy established for the North Sea basin, we can actually get fairly precise age estimates of the sampled horizons down to about 400,000 years, and this is their range through the sequence with PETM here. Data set is this is a preliminary data set, it's about 20,000 specimens. 450 species. Weirdly, despite all the work that's been done on these faunas for the past 200 years, we discovered 100 new species. So that's what happens with mollusks. A lot of these collections have been made over about the past 30 or 40 years due to construction projects, and it's data that hasn't been previously analysed. And I'm going to show you now a bunch of paleogeographic maps modified from NOx. I hope you can see the outlines, present day geography here. So the UK here and then Northern Europe. And basically the colours, the darker greens are the outlines of the North Sea basin, really from sort of mid-shelf down into the deepest part of the basin. The yellow here is sort of neritic sediments. And what I'm going to show here is the stratigraphy on the right-hand side. Some funny little pie charts, and each pie chart is a sampled horizon. And all it does is show in blue the percentage of specimens which are marine taxa versus brackish in white and freshwater in pink. And the dates up here. And these paleogeographic maps will show the dynamism of the system from the late Paleocene into the early Eocene. So in the late Paleocene, we have heavy minerals in the Hampshire Basin, London Basin, indicate that dominant current patterns were coming from the north. And in fact, we have a fauna of shallow marine sands and with dominantly cooler water mollusks, marine mollusks. If we go a little bit later, we have clearly the southwest approaches, the western approaches here were open, and we have shallow marine faunas actually which are more tropical in nature, and actually this is consistent with the direction of where heavy minerals have come from, Cornubia and Armorica. And again, dominantly fully marine taxa. Now in the late Paleocene, basically the PETM corresponds with this maximum of the Greenland mantle plume uplift underneath Greenland and Iceland, which is basically times with the unzipping of the North Atlantic and the rapid increase in width there. And this has profound effects on the paleogeography, so that one ends up with effectively land bridges here, and this magmatic province here effectively connects the UK with Greenland, and these land bridges allowed the migration of mammals, mollusks, well, you know, at least 2 phases of mammalian migration. And there are profound changes in the North Sea basin because it becomes this, this semi-enclosed North Sea with actually a closed connection with the Atlantic. So what happens? Well, with climate change at PETM interval, there's increased precipitation. There's a massive amount of turbidites being flowing off northern Scotland after there's 1 to 2 kilometres of uplift here. But the actual uplift of much of this region closes the Channel Seaway, and you actually end up with potentially a freshened North Sea, and that's indicated by the microfossil record. And so the Woolwich and Reading beds here is the PETM, and then actually in post-PETM times, the mollusk faunas still have a large component of brackish taxa. So it's not just for the PETM, but later they're also brackish taxa. And the key area here is this sort of marked as brackish and fresh water, sort of northern France, Belgium, southern England. Complicated this, but just bear with me. The classic interpretation of what's going on, and this is based from Sturbaut, is that effectively the mollusk faunas we've been looking at are in back barrier lagoons, and this accounts for their brackish and freshwater nature. Okay? And what I'm suggesting we're looking at actually is the mollusk faunas from this region might reflect the freshened margin of the North Sea. So we might be looking at marine faunas, which would be really interesting because it'd be one of the few places in the world where we got marine faunas through the PETM. And a key site actually here is 50 kilometres from here at Lower Upnor, where within the Pectodinium acme there's a horizon with thalassinoides and with this weird bunch of mollusks, which is actually a non-analog assemblage, non-analog community to anything you find today, because it comprises strictly marine taxa with a whole load of brackish taxa, which apparently were living together. Up into the early Eocene, we go into normal, effectively normal tropical marine faunas with a bunch of phases of immigration of tropical marine taxa, presumably through the western approaches. If we look at the assemblages and do an NMDS ordination, one ends up with 3 clusters, and very nicely those clusters, which are based on both assemblage composition and abundance, correspond to marine Paleocene, brackish and freshwater PETM, and the marine Eocene. So yeah, there's a really nice event there. If we look at range-through plots of species, 450 species at the PETM, black is marine taxa, green is brackish, so there's this major brackish element, but there's a survival of these presumably euryhaline taxa through the interval, which is really interesting. Sometime later, earliest Epresian, there's this immigration, Harwich formation transgression of a whole bunch of more tropical taxa, but then they go extinct 400,000 years later, and that appears to be a real pattern. It's not just a sampling artifact. I won't talk about that now, but it's very cool. Conclusions. Really, to understand PETM in Northwest Europe, and which kind of explains the paradox, is that the marine response is the result of the tight interaction of climates and tectonics. So it's not just a climate response. The ecological study here allows our reinterpretation, and I think we're probably looking at a brackish marine PETM fauna. Obviously, we need geochemical support for that, and that's underway. And it also appears that some euryhaline marine mollusks survived on the margins of the North Sea when the rest of the fauna was extirpated. So maybe it was also a refuge to some extent for some taxa. There is a NERC DTP PhD opportunity in this. This is preliminary data. There's a huge amount that needs to be done. Obviously lots more geochemistry, but also one's got to place this in the larger history of what's going on, which is there was basically a global biodiversity hotspot in the Paris Basin about 50 million years ago. And how does all this fit into the larger history? So thanks, that's all.